Hello and welcome back to game number 28 of the series Masters of the Chessboard. In this series we are going through the famous book by Richard Reti, Masters of the Chessboard, and we are looking at each of the games in that book one at a time and looking at Reti's analysis of those games. Now, before we start this game, Reti offers a bit of analysis into the Steinitz defense of the Ruy Lopez, and he says that the Steinitz defense is relatively unsound today. It's not that good, but it has a lot of historical importance. Now, the Steinitz defense against the Ruy Lopez. The original Steinitz defense against the Ruy Lopez started off with d6. Now, as Reti discussed quite thoroughly, d4 is the main response to d6. Because after e takes d4, we have this e pawn against this d pawn, and white just has a far better space advantage. Now, Reti comments that the Steinitz defense isn't really that good because to make the Steinitz defense work, black's almost forced at some point to push something like a6 or b5 or potentially f5 even, which all create sort of weaknesses and targets in the black position. He says that the idea of the Ruy Lopez is this attack on the e5 pawn. Now, black has a couple of options really. The idea of white is to try and take this e5 pawn, and white hopefully wants to force the defensive move d6, which is the whole idea of this, which is the Steinitz defense, d6 in this position. And once d6 has been played, white can then play d4, forcing that exchange, leaving the unfavourable, well, the better pawn structure for white. So therefore, black has a couple of options. Actually, first of all, let's have a look. After this capture, I say after knight takes d4, let's just look at this position very briefly. Reti comments that in this position, white's generally better because white's able to get the rooks to e1 and d1, where they'll quite clearly be quite a bit more active. And if you compare this to black's rook, well, the black's rook on e8 can be quite good, but on d8, it's not really doing as much because of this pawn. Likewise, black's bishop is blocked in by this pawn, and black's bishop here can't really come to f5 either. Whereas white's bishop has quite a bit more freedom, and this bishop also has a lot more freedom as well. And likewise, notice how this pawn controls the d5 square and the f5 square, giving potential outposts for the knights, whereas black's knights are a bit more restricted. So therefore, Reti comments that this position is generally quite a bit better for white because of this favourable pawn structure. So because of that, black doesn't really, taking on d4 and ending in that position perhaps isn't too good. So consequently, white wants to almost force black to take on d4, and black will therefore have essentially two options. They can potentially take on d4 and then try and push d5 at some point to free up their position, or they can go for f5 to free up their position. So that's the first option, to essentially try and free up their position by potential breaks. The second option might be to just accept the lack of space and just try and post their pieces in the best position they can, and black may want to try and exchange some pieces. So after this position, black may want to perhaps try and take this knight and then take this bishop. After something like this, knight takes here. Black would quite like this potentially, perhaps not straight away, but later on certainly, because black's exchanged two pieces, so now they're able to develop a bit more harmoniously. So that's black's two plans. Now, Reti gives a bit of a start of a model game, actually played by Tarrasch, this game was, where we see why black is almost forced to take on d4. And then the actual game of this video, which is Lasker versus Tarrasch, we see what happens if black avoids taking on d4. And Reti offers these two games as examples as to why the Steinitz defense is perhaps not so good. So in the first game, in this one is Tarrasch who's playing. We have e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5 going into the Ruy Lopez, knight f6. It's worth noting even something like d6 now. This is the old Steinitz defense, but even here, going into the Philidor, white's able to get d4 in, and this does score a lot better for white here. And Reti does comment that knight c6 doesn't really work too well, and you can get a bit of a favourable position by exchanging pawns and then taking the queens, or alternatively you can potentially transpose into the Steinitz defense version of the Ruy Lopez with bishop to b5. However, we don't see that. We see bishop to b5 now going into the Ruy Lopez, knight f6, potentially the start of the Berlin defense, castles, and now knight takes e4 is probably the main move. But if black doesn't want this, then d6 is almost forced to try and defend this pawn, because if they were to play something, if they were just pass the move, then you see d4, and after takes, this knight's being pushed away, this pawn's going to fall, white's got a very good space advantage. So d6 in this position is forced if black doesn't really take this pawn. And of course, as we've discussed before, when you have this pawn structure by black, it's very common for white to then push d4, especially if they can do it in one move, essentially counter-attacking this the center. Because after e takes d4, this e4 to d6 pawn structure is far better for white. So here, bishop d7. So here we see black trying to avoid giving up the center, and they're going to do this by trying to counter-attack e4. So after knight c3, note that if bishop takes, and now this pawn is attacked twice. So even if we have no way to defend it twice, so it's going to fall. And so after bishop d7, you often see knight c3 defending the pawn, because now if you have, let's say bishop b7, now if it's bishop takes, queen e2 is an option, or queen d3 is an option as well, defending this pawn twice. So instead we see bishop to e7, and now rook to e1. Now this is a option which Tarrasch played. Reti comments that I think queen d3 is perhaps the more commonly played move here. No, sorry, bishop takes, queen d3 is the more common move and is preferred because e4 is protected and e5 remains under attack. But instead we see rook to e1, and now in the game we're going to look at, we see e takes d4, and to demonstrate why this capture is forced, Reti offers this current game by Tarrasch, where black castled, and here black is essentially sacrificing this e-pawn, believing they will get sufficient compensation for the pawn. But it's actually a nice little combination. The bishop takes, d takes e5, d takes e5, queen takes e5. Note that we can't just take this pawn straight away, because after queen takes, rook takes, sorry, that would be disastrous because of knight takes, bishop takes, then the pawns have exchanged and it's a fairly equal position. So we see the queen coming off the board first, and now knight takes e5. And now black can't really take back because knight takes e4, sorry, bishop takes e4, knight takes e4, knight takes e4, we then see something like knight to d3. And now note that the rook is attacking both of these pieces. f5 is almost forced, and after f3, it would seem that black is perhaps out of the water. With this check, black removes this piece from that is under attack by the rook here, and if you take back, and you're seemingly fine. However, it's not quite the case. After knight takes c5, so I guess black was hoping for king f1 here, because then bishop to b6, f takes e4, f takes e4 check would win this knight. And that's a good point which I didn't actually cover. Note here, black takes back with the a rook, not the f rook, and that's so after this continuation. The pawn capture comes with check, winning the knight. However, you don't need to move the pawn. What actually happens is knight takes c5, knight takes c5, and now it seems in this position that black's sort of equalized. You know, it's a 3 on 2 pawn islands, both 3 on 3. It's a bishop versus knight, so it's a bit of an imbalance, but generally speaking, both sides have equalized. However, after bishop to g5, we see the issue. Bishop to e7 is coming, forking the rook and knight, and the only real option is rook to d5, essentially just giving up the exchange. Sorry, no, c4 is perhaps the best move, but we see the issue now. So that's why taking is almost forced in this position. And that was a game that Tarrasch played with white. His opponent was called Marco. I haven't looked a huge amount into it, but yeah. So now let's look at the actual game. So in the actual game, Lasker was black and Tarrasch was white. And we see Lasker actually go for the Steinitz defense. We see e4, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to b5, knight f6. I did comment that d6 is the Steinitz defense. That was the original Steinitz defense. However, this is perhaps the improved version of Steinitz defense, where you play knight f6 first, before d6. Now, as normal, when you've got d6 and e5, we see d4, bishop d7, knight to c3. This is all seen in the previous game. Bishop to e7, rook to e1, and this is the same position we got to in the previous game, except in the previous game black castled, thinking that they could trade off these 4 pawns and end in a equal position, which for black, if you achieve equality, is you've sort of come out of, you've achieved what you wanted in the opening, really. However, as we've seen, castling and giving up this pawn doesn't work. So instead, we see e takes d4 being forced because the alternatives don't succeed. Knight takes d4, and now castles. And now we see this position I was talking about earlier. We have the pawn on e4 and the pawn on d6. So black has given up the center and black has less space. And black now has 2 options. They can try and force through d5 to try and open up the center and removing white's favourable pawn position. And note that d5, e5 isn't always a good move. We discussed this quite a bit in the last game. It can be a massive strength if you can get e5 at the right moment, but e5 can also be a very big weakness. So you have to be sure that e5 is a good move before you play it. So black can force d5. That's one potential try. Perhaps not in here, but they'll have to prepare it and try and play for it. So d5 is one option. The alternative is to avoid equalizing in the center and just be content with having less space. So try and get your pieces to the best possible squares you can, and if possible exchange off some pieces. So for instance, black here would like to take on d4 and then take on b5, exchanging two possible sets of pieces, because the side which has less space wants to exchange more pieces, so they have more squares to put their current forces on. Now here Tarrasch takes on c6, and he does this because a set of pieces are going to be exchanged no matter what. Both this knight and this bishop are going. One of these two pieces are going to be exchanged regardless of what white does. So white chooses instead to just force the exchange and exchange just one set of pieces, because now white can pull back. If white didn't initiate those exchanges, then he might be forced to exchange two pieces. Now, interestingly, Steinitz in this position, I think, played b takes c6, which perhaps wasn't the best option. Bishop takes c6 offers a further exchange and helps prepare d5. For instance, if you play bishop d3, and d5 is immediately possible. There's 1, 2, 3 defenders to 2 defenders here. It's immediately possible. And even here, there's 2 attackers, 3 attackers. That's if the bishop was perhaps on e2. So Tarrasch still takes on c6, trying to delay d5. B takes c6. And now, with this b takes c6, this d5 pawn break can't really be prevented. And so Tarrasch instead maneuvers his knight to e2. He can't prevent d5, so he's just going to accept that it's going to happen, and he's instead going to maneuver his pieces to better squares. However, Lasker plays queen d7 first. Now, Reti comments that d5 was perhaps the simpler and more obvious move, but Lasker, being Lasker, goes for complications and tries to develop the rooks first, so d5 will have a bit more of an impact. It will be a bit stronger. It's worth noting, in this position, knight takes e4 doesn't work due to knight takes d4, opening up an attack on the knight, and if the knight retreats, knight takes c7 opens up an attack on the bishop and the queen. So black's going to lose a piece if they take on e4. But so instead of d5, we see queen d7, aiming to bring the rooks into play before he pushes d5. We have knight to g3, repositioning the knight, and now rook f to e8. And this is the error in Lasker's play. It stops the knight retreating to e8, and we'll see later on that that's actually essential, because after d5 you can push e5, which attacks the knight, and whilst e5 may be a weakness, the knight, it's only a weakness if it can't be defended or if it doesn't come with some form of initiative. And here we'll see that this knight not having a retreat square is game over almost. So this is the main error, really. He should have played perhaps rook to d8 and rook to b8. Now we see b3. The idea is to fianchetto the bishop, and it also defends the b pawn against any rook b8 nonsense. Rook a to d8, bishop to b2, and now black can't play d5. Lasker got his rooks to the central fires as he wanted, so d5 will have more effect, but he can't play d5. If he plays d5 now, as discussed, e5 will happen. And where's this knight going to go? If it goes to g4, that might seem like a good place because it's defended by the queen. But after e6, what's going to happen? If the queen takes, you lose the exchange. If the pawn takes, you lose the knight. So the knight can't go to g4. Obviously, h5 is under attack by the queen. If it goes to here, knight takes e4, d takes e4, queen takes, rook takes, and you're just a pawn down. And look at this structure. This is quite an easily won endgame for white. So d5 in this position would lose to e5 because this knight is stuck. It needed that e8 retreat square. So Lasker made a bit of an error. He's in a worse position here, Lasker is, and it wasn't intentional. So Lasker sees he can't get d5, so instead he tries to get some complications, and he goes for some very risky play. So he goes for some complications which essentially gives white an isolated e-pawn, and the position that arises after white's isolated e-pawn is worse for black. And I think Lasker already comments that Lasker knows it is worse for black. However, for white to take advantage of that position, white needs to play very energetically, very attacking style of chess. But Lasker knows that Tarrasch doesn't like that attacking style of chess. Tarrasch's play style is to suffocate and restrict and really limit the opponent and just strangle them to death. That's more of Lasker's play style. It's a bit of an exaggeration, but that is Lasker's style. So he goes for a variation which I think Reti comments that he probably knows isn't as good, but for Tarrasch to take advantage of it, Tarrasch has to go outside of his normal play style. So here he plays knight to g4, and here we see bishop takes g7, knight takes f2. Note, if the king takes, then knight f5 check defends the knight. Well, sorry, knight f5 check will just be better for white here, because you then take on g4 and you're threatening mate. The queen's ready to attack. This is just a better position. So instead he takes on f2. Note this pawn is now isolated. So king takes f2. Reti comments that queen to queen d3 then. Queen to d4 may be an alternative. White would get a very strong counterattack this way, and maybe better than trying to play for the winning of a pawn, which is what Tarrasch actually does. So this is more a case of going for a very dynamic counterattack against black, which I think with Reti comments that Lasker probably knew that this was the better move and probably would be better for white, and he may well not be able to defend. However, Lasker also knew that this wasn't in Tarrasch's style. When he played knight g4 and knight takes f2, he probably knew that Tarrasch wouldn't play this queen d4 line because it's just not what Tarrasch does. So this is, I think, why Reti comments that this knight g4 move is an objective blunder, because the queen d4 move that we just saw is better for white. It's definitely better. White's winning there. However, although it's objectively it's a blunder, it's unsound, it doesn't really work, psychologically it's a brilliant move. You see how Lasker is playing his opponent rather than playing the best moves. So bishop takes, king takes. Oh, sorry, yeah, king doesn't take. We see knight takes f2. So instead of queen d4, we see king takes f2, king takes g7, followed by queen to d4. Oh no, sorry. First of all, knight f5 check, followed by king h8, and now queen d4 check, trying to pick up this pawn. f6, king h8 is met with mate. So f6, queen takes a7. And here Reti comments that white now looks to have a better position, and does have a better position. White has the extra pawn, and white looks like they potentially have the initiative because black's very cramped here. However, white's pawn is isolated on e4, and we know that in isolated pawn positions you have to control the square in front of the pawn, and that's what's happening here. Lasker has full control over this e5 square. Now here we see bishop f8, queen to d4, attacking this pawn, rook to e5. And now Reti comments that the game is balanced. White has a passed pawn on the queen side as a one extra pawn as well, but black has a pawn as a central majority. Black has control of the center. Yes, white has more space, but black can force open the center if they need to. However, equally, although it's as balanced as it's going to be, white probably still has the advantage because of this passed pawn, because of their space advantage, and black's position still being cramped. White still has the advantage. Like, where's this bishop going to go? It could go to here or here, and that's about it. If it goes to here, it's just going to be taken. White has the activity here. White has the options here. However, for white to really take advantage of this position, Reti comments that you need to play very energetically, very dynamically. You have to play very attacking chess almost. Like the computer is just recommending g4 currently. However, this wasn't in Tarrasch's playstyle. So Lasker instead Lasker takes advantage of black's strengths. Lasker takes advantage of the fact that he's got this central pawn majority, he's got control of his e5 square. Whereas white, Tarrasch doesn't really take advantage of the fact he's got these pawns. This pawn never moves. I think it does move later on in the game, but only once to a4, and that's it. He doesn't take advantage of the fact he has more space. He doesn't take advantage of the fact that he can go on an attack here. So here, Lasker played rook a to d1. We see rook d to e8 doubling up. And now queen to c3, queen to f7, and now knight to g6. Now, Reti comments that the knight was well placed on f5. It was stopping any potential bishop h6 moves, meaning this bishop is currently redundant, and it is very aggressively placed here. But on g3, it retreated to defend the king's side a bit more. But this just lets the bishop come out. Now we see queen to f3, d5, going for that pawn break in the center, e takes d5, and now we see bishop to e3 check. So after king f1, obviously king e1 would just be, you just put in a king in front of a double rook battery. So king f1 is the only other move. We now see c takes d5, and now you see that Lasker has the central pawn. After he plays something like c4, he will have the pawn center. And now we see rook to d3, trying to attack this bishop, trying to get rid of this bishop. Now Tarrasch commented that he felt knight f5 was perhaps the way to go here. He said that this was perhaps the last chance that white had to keep this game in their advantage. And knight f5 is the computer's move. But in the game, Tarrasch didn't find it. He played rook to d3. And Lasker responds with queen to e6, defending the bishop. We see rook to e2, f5, rook to d1, f4, and now this bishop is stuck, the knight's under attack. Knight jumps to h1, and that's a pretty depressing move to make. d4, and you just see Lasker's just controlling the position. He's got full control over this file. The bishop is very well cemented and controlling all of the dark squares in white's position. Now Tarrasch tries knight f2, but now Lasker is able to force the decision with what Reti describes as two beautiful moves, two beautiful queen moves. The first one is queen a6. Now here we see knight to d3, attacking the rook, rook to g5, rook to a1, and now the second move is queen to h6. It's worth noting a4 doesn't work that well. We'll see later on that the king actually moves to d1. Now obviously if you play a4, then that king can't move to d1 because the rook's there. So he plays rook a to a1, and now queen h6, and these are the two brilliant queen moves, queen a6 and queen h6. And this pawn can't be defended. If you play something like h3, then rook g3 will come, just threatening a queen sacrifice on h3. You know, let's say you just retreat the queen. Queen takes h3 is coming, because if you take, that's mate. And queen h1 is also mate. It's just game over in this position. So the pawn can't really be defended by pushing it. So instead, we see king to e1, starting to try and retreat the king out of harm's way. Queen takes h2 anyway. King to d1. Queen to g1 check. And now knight to e1, defending against the check. Now we see rook g to e5, doubling up again along this open file. The focal point is very much e1 now. And now we see queen to c6. Now rook to e6. The idea was to try and stop black from going for this bishop f2 move, because white can potentially sacrifice the queen for two rooks. No, it can't. Yeah, white can sacrifice the queen for the two rooks, and in this position, I think Tarrasch thought he might be able to hold. It's still a lot better for white, but he's got two rooks for a queen and a bishop for a knight. So materially, it's fairly even. Interestingly, though, it perhaps would have been better for something like rook takes e5 first. Because after queen takes e1, rook takes e1, rook takes e1, rook takes a1. This was actually probably black's best option here. This isn't the variation which Reti gives, but this is probably the better option, and Lasker may well have saw this himself. And this is just now better for white. So that's the threat that queen c6 has. It's not an immediate threat, but it's a threat which prevents bishop f2. So we see rook to e6, queen takes c7, rook to e8, no, sorry, rook 8 to e7 even, queen to d8 check, and king to g7. And now we see a4, and now we see f3, a nice little pawn sacrifice. And the idea is to retreat the bishop to f5. So the idea of that is, if instead you played this, then it might be some options where you can perhaps take here and sacrifice the queen for the two rooks again, trying to go for the same sort of position we saw earlier. Alternatively, you could just take the rook here, because this rook's still defended. After this, queen d7 check would win. It wouldn't quite win the rook, would it? But there are probably some perpetual checks along here, somewhere along the line. So that's the idea of f3, to allow this bishop to retreat to f5, opening up the rooks to e1, and defending this e6 rook against the queen. So we see g takes f3, and bishop g5, And here, white resigned. So Tarrasch resigned in his position because he knew that there was nothing he could do. The threat perhaps was after rook takes e6, rook takes e6, queen to d7, rook e7, the queen is under attack, and the knight on e1 is under attack. And coincidentally, therefore, so is the rook on a1. So that was the threat, and that was why, in this position, Tarrasch resigned, because I'm just looking at the computer. The computer's favourite move here is queen takes c7, where you just take back with the rook, and you haven't really solved much here. White's clearly still losing. So that was it. That was game number 28, with a bit of introduction to the Steinitz defence of the Ruy Lopez. And it's quite an interesting game. I quite like this game. It shows it's a lot more indicative of Lasker's play style, where he tries to play sound, objectively good chess. However, when he perhaps ended up in a worse position, he played to his opponent. He played a move which maybe objectively is unsound, but he knew that his opponent wouldn't be able to take advantage of it. And he knew that it was going against his opponent's playstyle. So it's a lot more psychological, which is a bit more along Lasker's playstyle. So I hope you like this game, and I hope you liked the video. If you did, please like, comment and subscribe, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you for watching.